Have you ever wondered why a cut sometimes becomes red and swollen and filled with pus? Or why you got the chickenpox once but never got it again? Well, in order to answer these questions, we're going to take a look at the human body's immune system. And let's start with an overview because the immune system in our bodies is very complex. Our immune system is designed to fight off pathogens. Pathogens are biological agents that cause disease. These could be bacteria, like these bacteria in a person's intestines. They could be viruses. Here is an HIV virus. Could be fungi. Here is some fungus, some pathogenic fungus. Or they could be protists. These are protists that cause the African sleeping sickness by attacking your red blood cells. So to fight off these pathogens, humans have many defenses. We can break up our immune system into two types of immunity. Innate, which means what we're born with, what we inherit, and acquired, what we develop during our lifetimes. The innate immunity can be divided into three categories: external defenses, the inflammatory response, and fever. Meanwhile, acquired immunity can be divided into active and passive immunity, and then that can be further divided. So now we're going to take a look in more detail at these different types of defenses. Let's start with innate immunity. One type of innate immunity is the body's physical barriers to pathogens. And these barriers are general. They respond the same way to any pathogen. And the goal is to prevent pathogens from entering the body. So, for example, your skin is a barrier to pathogens, the mucus in your respiratory tract, the cilia that try to brush out any pathogens that get caught there, your tears, stomach acid, all of these are external barriers. The inflammatory response is the next step in defense, and this occurs if one of your physical barriers gets breached. So let's say, for example, you have a cut in your skin. Now that first external defense, the skin, has been broken, and bacteria have a chance to enter. Well, what happens is when bacteria enter, a chemical called histamine is released. And this is basically like an alarm bell for your body. And it tells other parts of your body to do things. What it does is it has the blood vessels expand. They become bigger so more blood can rush to the site of the infection. And as they're rushing to the site of the infection, white blood cells called phagocytes appear. And once the phagocytes get to the site of the infection, they eat the bacteria that have invaded. And like the external defenses, this response is general. It doesn't matter what pathogen enters the body, the same thing will happen. Histamine is released, the vessels expand, and white blood cells eat the invader. The last type of innate immunity is fever. If you have an infection inside the body, your body's temperature will rise a few degrees. And the goal of that is to try and stop or inhibit the growth of pathogen. If the body temperature is a little too hot for the pathogen to survive, that can help prevent it from spreading through your system. Now let's move to acquired immunity. The first type of acquired immunity is active immunity. It's called active because your body has to do work to get this immunity. So one way your body can get resistance to a disease is by being infected by a pathogen. And of course that's a lot of work and it's very unpleasant, but the upside is that you'll then be resistant to the pathogen in the future. Another way to get acquired immunity actively is to receive a vaccination. When you receive a vaccination, what you're really getting is an injection of dead or weakened pathogens. And again, when your body is exposed to those pathogens, it has to work to build a defense against it. But the benefit is the same. Your body gains resistance in the long term to that specific type of pathogen. So note that if you're infected, let's say, for example, by chickenpox, you'll get immunity to chickenpox, but that's not necessarily going to give you immunity to the cold or the flu. Similarly, if you get a vaccination to measles, that's not going to give you immunity to a different disease. It's only going to give you immunity to that specific pathogen. Then there is passive acquired immunity. This is where your body doesn't have to do much work. One way to get passive immunity is natural. You might get antibodies from your mother. What's an antibody? Well, it's a defensive protein. And this can happen during pregnancy or during breastfeeding. You can also get antibodies artificially. If you're really sick, you could get an injection of a serum that contains antibodies. Now, both of these are specific, but they're temporary, so that's the downside to receiving passive immunity. They'll only last as long as you're receiving the antibodies from the other source. So why is acquired immunity so specific? Well, we have to take a look at the different cells involved in it to understand. So here is a pathogen, and if you look at the pathogen, there are little proteins on the surface. Those proteins are called antigens, and what they are is they're basically like chemical ID tags. They tell your body that this is a foreign cell that doesn't belong. And the way that those antigens are recognized is by antibodies. Antibodies are proteins that your body makes. They are defensive proteins. And as you can see, antibodies will bind to the antigens. Now, each type of antigen will only be bound by one specific type of antibody. It's like a lock and a key. So there's many antigens out there and many antibodies. And once the antibody has bound to the antigen, it has marked it for destruction. Now your body knows that this is an invader and it must be destroyed. How does that happen? Well, let's take another look. So the antibodies themselves are made by a type of white blood cell called B cells. Here you can see that the cell is producing antibodies, which then head off to bind the antigens. So this is a key part of acquired immunity. Now, once the antibodies have bound to the antigen, a macrophage, another type of white blood cell, can come along and eat it through the process of phagocytosis. You might recognize these as pseudopods. And here's an actual image of a white blood cell phagocytosing some bacterial cells. So again, this is a type of white blood cell. You might also hear it called a phagocyte because it does phagocytosis. And its job is to surround and eat pathogens once they've been marked by the antibodies. Now, why is it that when you get an infection, you're later resistant to it? Well, it has to do with memory cells. You see, after those B cells make antibodies for a particular pathogen, the B cells will remember that pathogen, and they'll rest, they'll turn into memory cells. But if you ever get infected a second time, they're going to remember that pathogen and they're going to be able to respond much more quickly. So really, it's because of your B cells turning into memory cells that you gain resistance after you've been infected or after you've received a vaccination. However, acquired immunity needs a little bit more than just B cells and antibodies, because what happens if some of your cells are actually infected? Well, unfortunately, those are casualties of war and they need to be killed. And they are killed by killer T cells. What they do is basically they punch holes in the infected cells or in cancer cells and kill them. And here is an actual killer T cell destroying an infected body cell. These you'll also hear called cytotoxic T cells because they're poisonous. Finally, another important part of acquired immunity is helper T cells. Helper T cells do just that. They help B cells and cytotoxic T cells do their job. So they might activate B cells or they might unactivate B cells. So this leads us to how immunity is actually acquired. Let's say you're exposed to an antigen. Your body will make antibodies to that antigen, antigen X. This is known as the primary immune response. And as you can see, it takes about 3 weeks to make this many antibodies. But let's say that you're exposed to it a second time. Because of the memory cells, in a much shorter period, your body will make many more antibodies. So the first time you're exposed, you'll probably feel sick because it takes your body a while to respond to it. But during the second exposure, you probably won't even know that you're infected because your body responds so quickly. Meanwhile, however, if you're infected by a different antigen, let's say Y, your body has to go through the same process, the primary immune response. And that concludes our exploration of the immune system.